Welcome back. I'm sure you are enjoying the stories of Emperor Claudius and even more so Emperor Nero that we have in the video regarding in the history series regarding those two emperors. And now we're going to look at, in our literature series, on the two authors who relate most closely to Emperor Nero and also indirectly Emperor Claudius. In the first one, we're going to look at Petronius' work called Satyricon, and then in the next video immediately thereafter, we will look at Seneca's work, the Apocalyptosis. Now, Satyricon, unfortunately, is almost an impossible work for anyone to follow competently because it is so fragmentary. So in order to make it easier for you to get some idea of what's going on in this work and why it's important for you to understand it, we'll focus on a couple of incidents that illustrate some key points about this work. You should understand also, as you'll see in the video about satire and novel, that this is an example of a Roman novel, a piece of extended prose literature, but it is also a Menippean satire, as described in that video, because it is a mixture of prose and poetry. Also, a lot of those inserted tales that you probably saw here and there with some difficulty trying to make them out are examples of that same Milesian tale tradition that again is described in that satire novel video. The Milesian tales are these tales that are interspersed with each other. They're interlocked. Character in the middle of one tale will stop to interrupt the narrative with his own narrative about some other tale, and they build up in that particular way. So you should realize that some of that influences the way that this work goes, and that the particular episodes that occur with this rather crazy group of characters, these homosexuals, are in that particular tradition. So again, to make things fairly straightforward, let me focus on the two major stories that probably could theoretically have made the most sense to you. The story of Trimalchio is the main episode in the middle of the work, the big dinner party. Luckily, that part of the work survives relatively intact, and we get a really refreshing and wonderful view of what goes on at a Roman dinner party. Admittedly, this is extreme, with course after course after course after course. So just imagine not just one 7-course meal, but 10 of them. And that basically gives you what the banquet of Trimalchio was like. As you could probably see in the words, it was a pretty disgusting affair. The sense that we get during all those conversations in the middle when Trimalchio waddles off to the bathroom is that no one really wants to be there, and no one is really particularly happy in one's life. And we'll talk a little bit about the culture that obtains with Trimalchio to understand what's going on with those guests. There's actually more to it than just a simple dinner party. There's all social obligation that comes into this. The mythology regarding Trimalchio can be seen in a couple of places. One is that Trimalchio himself tries to let on that he's in fact a mythological expert, which he clearly isn't because he gets the details mixed up. And the other, you may remember near the beginning of the dinner party, when Encolpius, the narrator, is walking in, he's startled very suddenly to see this gigantic statue of a dog and the inscription Cave Canem, beware of the dog. And of course, the dog itself is a rather funny thing for him to get startled by, because of course it's not a real dog. But also, of course, the sense of the guard dog ties in with Cerberus, the guard dog of the underworld. We almost get a sense that as Encolpius walks into this palace where this dinner is going to be served, that he's walking into a kind of a hellish environment, and by the time he emerges, he actually might be lucky to escape with his life. One doesn't know. Okay, so there's that incident, and then we have the story of the widow of Ephesus, which is told during a later episode in the novel when the characters are on board a ship, and one of the characters during the ship voyage on deck narrates the story of the widow of Ephesus to describe that in fact even very chaste, upstanding women cannot be fully trusted when it comes to morality. Okay, so let me describe both of these to illustrate what's going on here. Trimalchio is in fact a freedman, and when we way back in our history series, talked about the different classes in Rome. You may remember that we talked about the equites class, the knights. Remember that these were the businessmen, the nobilitas or nobility, citizens of Rome who were not necessarily connected with any outstanding families from years back, although, of course, potentially they could be, but were more successful with their management of money, with their business, their finances, merchantry, and other associated activities than they were because of some particular family background that got them to where they needed to be. So the equites are those who are wealthy enough to make their own way, not necessarily dependent on family background. Now, among the groups of citizens who could potentially become equites could obviously be plebeians, who therefore now no longer are completely disadvantaged by their lack of connection with the upper class by family connection. But this is also a possibility for freedmen. So when a Roman citizen was manumitted a Roman slave was manumitted and became a Roman citizen, the manumission involved a change on the relationship between the former master and the former slave. The slave now is enfranchised as a citizen and can now conduct his own life as if he were a complete Roman freeborn citizen. But there are some restrictions on his life as to political offices, for instance, that he can run for, some of which he cannot as a freedman, and also the possibilities for marriage, because in the upper classes, it may not be possible for a freedman to marry into those highest-ranking families, certainly not the senatorial ones. In addition to that, the freedman also had important obligations to his former master. That is one of the bases for one of the most important social relationships that exists in Roman society. The patron-client relationship. The patron, and you should notice the connection with pater, father, patrician, senator, and so forth. The patron is an illustrious Roman citizen figure who has people who follow after him, and those are the clients. The patron is one who may be formally or informally responsible for the caretaking of quite a few other people who are socially dependent upon him in some way, and in some cases maybe financially dependent as well. So the patron has done a lot of favors for a lot of these other people. As a result, these people owe him acknowledgement, as they will in fact do in Roman daily life. Every morning the clients will go and visit their patrons in order to try to get additional handouts and also to pay their proper respects to the patron. The clients are responsible for helping out the patrons should the patrons be in need of something. The clients are supposed to be there to be called upon, and the clients will probably remain socially and economically dependent on the patrons. The patron may be needed, for instance, to help the client get established in business, make a particular relationship with someone, attach himself to somebody in high political office if necessary. The patron can do a lot to help the clients along. In exchange for that, the clients have a certain social obligation to the patron whenever the patron needs their help. So, one example of this patron-client relationship was that between freedman and former master. At Trimalchio's dinner, Trimalchio himself is the wealthiest of the freedmen, so much so that near the beginning of the party, he actually asks a slave how many estates he owns because he's lost track of how many there are. At one point, he refers to an estate and says, I think I own one somewhere in southern Italy someplace. Is that right? He can't even remember all of his finances because they're so enormous. Trimalchio, therefore, has a lot of clients of his own. So interestingly, although he is a freedman, he is effectively a patron to all of the people who are at that party. So anybody who is at that dinner party has received an invitation in some formal way from Trimalchio, the patron, and therefore is obliged to be there. And presumably they would not get money, they would not get connections, they would not get, in general, any kind of worthwhile livelihood in Rome unless, or anywhere else, such as in Pompeii, let's say, unless they towed the line and did what they were supposed to do for their patrons, including showing up when they were invited, paying the proper honorifics and all that type of thing. So as you can imagine, this is not a really great life for the clients because they're always hanging on to somebody who is better off than them, and there's not really a lot of very effective ways to rid themselves of that sometimes very noxious relationship. So in that sense, the freedmen, even though they now have a higher standing than slaves do, in the sense of being Roman citizens, still have this stigma of being essentially less successful than true, real freeborn citizens. And they always have that sense of dependency to somebody else who's always there to either help them or potentially maybe harm them if they don't toe the line properly. And so the freedmen, although free, have some restrictions on their freedom. So you can therefore see clearly in the banquet of Trimalchio how very ill at ease most of those guests are. You remember, for instance, with the accident that happens with the boy who was doing the acrobatics and he falls, and you remember the immediate reaction from the people watching. Oh well, I guess we better groan or express distress about this man because this boy because they actually hated the boy. They really didn't care whatsoever whether he broke his neck or not, but they were really worried that potentially they would now get called into a funeral, and they would have to oblige that and change all their lives around in order to go. And of course, they can't stand the boy, so now they have to mourn somebody that they actually can't stand, and so forth. So you can see how again these social obligations are all built in, and how very tiresome and loathsome they are for these people. And as the dinner party gets underway, and Trimalchio gets more and more drunk, and Fortunata walks around with all her jewelry and makes herself rather ostentatious and annoying. And then, as you remember, at the end, Trimalchio and she actually get into a fight, and Trimalchio finally hits her with a dish. It's pretty awful stuff that everybody is viewing, and really nobody wants to be there, in fact. The food itself is very unappetizing, and the whole environment is just simply really quite annoying. One would do better to be elsewhere. So what you have satirized in this dinner is the social mobility that freedmen can have. Taken to an extreme, you can end up with these essentially fat, lazy, guzzling pig types that can end up being essentially like a daimyo on his seat in Japanese culture, sort of there, acting like this magnate who can give out favors any way he wants to, and also criticize people any way he wants to, and everybody has to go along and say yes master, and nobody's in a position to really contradict it. So it's really great to see this highlight. Even the dialect of language that we get in this is the language of the commoners. That's quite different from the normal, very elevated, literate type of Latin that we get in most of the works that we have, like Cicero, Caesar, and so forth. It's kind of nice to have an example of this, and in fact, it's very possible that this work got to us by accident. It might not necessarily have been meant to be a work to survive, so we're very fortunate to have as much of it as we have. So that's the incident with Trimalchio. Widow of Ephesus, as we said before, and we'll talk about in the Satire Magic video, is an example of a Milesian tale. One of these Eastern tales that's placed inside another tale in order to illuminate some broader point that's going on in the main story. And the Widow of Ephesus herself is maybe a little bit a takeoff on the concept of the perfectly chaste woman that you may remember was given to us with the rape of Lucretia back in Livy. Again, Lucretia was the model of the perfectly chaste wife waiting for her husband to come home from battle or from war, taking care of the house properly. And as you remember, she becomes the unhappy victim of the lust of the son of the king, Sextus Tarquinius. Now, in this case, we have a woman who is described as perfectly chaste, who is mourning her deceased husband and is in fact threatening to stay completely bottled up inside the mausoleum with the corpse of her husband so that she might eventually pass away. It starts off looking very attractive. However, a guard comes by and sees her mourning her husband excessively, essentially. There was a sense of moderation with mourning, that although one is supposed to go through the due process of mourning, one is eventually supposed to rejoin society. So as kind of a mockery of that idea, we have the guard successfully prevail upon the woman to partake of food and drink, and then the connection with him, a very handsome-looking guy. And so she makes the promise to stay faithful to her husband. Remember, that's sort of similar to Dido with her oath to her deceased husband, Zacchaeus. And remember how in Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, Dido's ghost actually joins with the ghost of Zacchaeus as a rejection of Aeneas. But in this case, we flip that. We end up with the widow, who, by the way, goes completely unnamed in this story. The widow quickly violates the oath that she makes to her husband by connecting with this soldier. Then it takes a weird turn, and it's a little hard to interpret exactly what's going on in this story. But when the soldier and the widow emerge next morning after their time together overnight, the soldier discovers that one of the things that he was supposed to be guarding, which were these 3 crucifixes that were hung up near the cemetery. A crucifix would be used to suspend a criminal who had died, who was not to be given a proper burial. There was always a threat that the family may come in the middle of the night and steal the corpse and give it the burial that it wasn't entitled to. So in the middle of the night, somebody did that because the guard was not paying attention properly because he was in the mausoleum with the widow. So when he gets up the next morning and sees this, he panics because he expects to be sentenced to death for it. She, however, rescues him by substituting the body of her husband onto the cross, making everybody wonder when they get up later in the day and come around. They see the body up there and they wonder, how in the world did that body get from there to there? And that's the sardonic point about the in which you have this woman who's described as of wonderful chastity, very helpful for this man, doesn't want to see herself widowed a second time, and so she goes to the trouble of providing the body of her husband to help out the welfare of this new lover by saying, let's put him up on the crucifix, which of course is the most disgraceful thing one could possibly do to a corpse. And so the woman sacrifices the body of her husband that she's been mourning over on and on previously, to put it up on the cross to help out this guy that she's never actually met before. It's a really warped story, and that's the point. This is an entirely satirical, warped story illustrating that one cannot in fact trust the morality of even the most chaste women. So that's kind of the tenor of what goes on with Satyricon. The rest of it is a series of disjointed incidents from our standpoint because of the fragmentary nature of the work, but all having to do with the quest of Encolpius, the guy who's been stricken impotent by the god Priapus, to regain his potency. We don't know whether he actually got it or not. I have to say, quite frankly, in my opinion, this dude really doesn't deserve it. Okay, in our next video coming right along, we will look at Seneca's work, The Pumpkinification of Claudius, or Apocolocyntosis. Come on right back.